Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeleine Gupta, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Patricia Sulser. Ms. Sulser is the Chief Counsel at the International Finance Corporation, the private sector investment arm of the World Bank, where she has been working since 1992. She is based in Washington. She's the global lead lawyer for IFC Infra Ventures, a $150 million internally managed fund established by IFC in 2008 to fund and proactively develop private and public-private partnership infrastructure projects in the poorest World Bank countries. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Sulser.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Bechtel, and I have the pleasure of introducing Bernard Sheahan. Mr. Sheahan is Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources at IFC, a member of the World Bank Group. He's responsible for the IFC's investment and global engagement in the power, transport, utilities, mining, and oil and gas industries. Bernie has served as IFC Director of Strategy with responsibility for the development of IFC's operational strategy and business plans, incorporating sustainability into IFC activities and the development of the Equator Principles. Bernie holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and an MBA from Harvard University. Please welcome Mr. Sheahan.
Well, thanks. We are delighted to be here. I'm so glad, again, for the invitation from Joanne and Professor Joyce for allowing us to share our experience in the infrastructure area from the perspective of the World Bank Group, and specifically International Finance Corporation. I'm especially glad, actually, that you're all working on infrastructure projects for your defenses or your papers and everything like that. And I think it's a really important area. Actually, Bernie and I have both devoted most of our professional lives to the infrastructure sector in developing countries, and especially the least developed countries. So it's an area that's close to our hearts, and I think I hope we can get across to you some of the challenges that we face, some of the successes, some of the maybe not such huge successes, some of the things we've learned over the years working in this area. And we'll try to dovetail as well as we can with the reading you've done from Justice Lin, the chief economist of the World Bank's chapters from Against the Consensus. And maybe we'll dovetail even with Professor Joyce's session yesterday or Monday on infrastructure. I think we really are going to try to be as pragmatic as we can, and we're going to try to leave some room for discussion at the end and questions and answers. I think, if something's not clear, obviously raise your hands and so on, but I think we'll have a pretty good time. I was just going to say also, I think that I know you're all lucky to be in the Albright Institute and so on, but when I was in college, Bernie's much younger than I am, actually, even though I was told to remind everybody that he's actually my client, so I actually have to be very respectful of him. But when I was in college...
I'm happy you think of that once in a while, Pat.
Honestly, international development didn't cross my mind when I was at college. I was an English lit major here at Wellesley, and I remember I went into a radio production after I left Wellesley. And I eventually decided, I was in business school briefly, and then I switched to law school where I became a lawyer and went into practice in a white shoe Wall Street law firm. And I was in the London and the Hong Kong offices in New York. And I remember suddenly thinking, I don't really want to be doing the kind of corporate thing. I'm working for all these big companies, not against it, but it wasn't really challenging. It didn't really sort of capture my interest. And one of my friends said, why don't you consider working for the World Bank? And I said, the World Bank? What's the World Bank? What a pretentious name. But that was many years ago, and I've been there since 1992, as you heard. And my job has morphed from one thing to another. I do project development now, which we'll talk a little bit about. And I hope we can engage in a nice discussion, and we'll have Bernie lead off with a couple of case studies and come back to a couple of principles throughout the discussion, and maybe come away with some takeaways at the end that I hope will help you on your papers and your projects. So off you go.
Thanks a lot, Patty. And just to prove that it's not only English majors who can go into infrastructure, in my case, I was medieval history at Dartmouth. So if you're either English or medieval history, you got a great career in front of you. So, developing countries. Let's start by taking you to Senegal. Now, Senegal, some of you actually might not inconceivable that one or more of you actually wind up here. So I think if you look backwards over the last couple of decades, would have been pretty unusual for somebody coming out of a place like Wellesley or anywhere in the U.S. to wind up in a Senegal. But going forward, over the next couple of decades, you got a much better chance of winding up in a place like this. An easy way to think about it that I always find helpful is over the past couple of decades, roughly 70% of all the growth in the economy of the world, 70% of the world GDP was created in OECD countries, so the US, Europe, or Japan. Going forward, most projections are for the next 2 to 3 decades, that 70% is going to belong to developing countries. And since economic growth tends to correlate pretty closely with jobs, chances are a lot of the more interesting jobs are going to be in places like Senegal. So imagine Senegal is the one that you wind up in. Lovely place, nice weather most of the time, lots of things to see, and specifically you wind up in the capital here, Dakar. Now if you look at the map, you can see that Dakar kind of stretches out on this little point going out into the Atlantic Ocean. And if we look more closely at Dakar itself, you can see it's mainly on a peninsula here. Here is the main part of the city here. Now, infrastructure and geography tend to be very closely linked in a lot of ways. One important one here in Dakar, specifically related to this. And as you can notice, this is a very narrow point. So you have an old city here with the main economic activities. The airport is around here. Now, the problem is Dakar, like cities throughout the world, in particular throughout the emerging world, is growing like gangbusters. Population has grown probably 4 or 5 times over the last couple of decades. And what used to be a nice sort of compact city here now has a population spread out essentially over this area. This little airport here, I'm amazed every time my plane actually lands there, is not going to be there for long. You have a new airport being set up somewhere right around here, around the town of Rufisque. So today, this is where most of the jobs are in Dakar, and if you get a job there, that's likely where your office is going to be. But most of the places to live are either out here or increasingly out in this particular area. So to get to the work, you're going to face a commute. And this is what your commute is going to look like on a good day in Dakar. You can tell it's a good day because there's actually space between the cars. And this is pretty unusual in Dakar, and in fact, in a lot of the developing world. You can also tell it's a good day because you can see out your window. The windshield hasn't been broken yet by something's coming up from the road. So it's a little bit difficult to get back and forth. Again, as I said, this is a good day. On a bad day, which might be during the rainy season, and Dakar is near the tropics, so definitely there are some rainy days. Here's another part of the main road going in from the more densely populated areas into the main city. So this is not a very easy way to get back and forth to work going through here. Now this problem has been on the plate for the government in Senegal for quite some time. And the solution, from a planning perspective, is obvious. You're going to build a better road to get people in and out. So this is sort of the broad game plan. You're going to build this road here, going through in different trunks. It's going to be a nice modern road, in theory, and it's going to get people back and forth. Now the problem is that plan had been on the plate for about 20 years. And the problem here facing the government in Senegal, very similar to problems facing governments in many developing countries, which is how do I actually get this done? So for the government of Dakar, 20 years of planning back and forth, very little progress. Finally, about 3 to 4 years ago, hit on a plan that was actually going to work. It was a public-private partnership. And we'll talk more about what public-private partnerships are as we go through here. And they said, okay, we're finally going to figure out how we find the money to do this. And we are, with the help of World Bank, a number of other consultants and advisors, some lawyers, put together a plan to put this road together. The problem is, part of the problem for the government is it doesn't have any of the money to actually do this. This is actually quite expensive. This is about the total capital expenditure for this is roughly 1 to 2% of the size of the economy. That's a lot of money for a country like Dakar, or really any country. So what we wind up with is a infrastructure project where the public sector does a number of things. First, the public sector actually clears the way for a road to be built. And that's already pretty expensive. Euro 132 at that point, a bit under $200 million to do, moving a number of households in order to do that. Then, upgrading the areas around the roads to help move some of the people that are affected, and to allow, again, the road to come through, and which still leaves about $300 million that needs to be found to build this road. And here is where the private part of the public-private solution comes in. It says we're going to do this using the private sector. And that essentially means finding a way to get users to pay for the cost of the infrastructure, in this case the road, $230 million. This was the first greenfield, the first newly built toll road in all of sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa. And this is what it looks like since its opening about 3 months ago. So you can actually see it looks like a highway that you would expect to see. And when you're driving, you actually are able to drive back and forth. Time of commuting from this area out here, where again a lot of the housing is, where you might be if you were finding a job in Dakar, to your job here, has gone from an average of slightly over 2 hours to now about 40 minutes. The economic value of created by building this road and the time saved, estimated by our colleagues at the World Bank, 2.5% of the economy. So here's a specific example of the private sector coming in partnership with the government to build some needed infrastructure in order to solve a problem. What we're going to do is try to do over the course of the rest of the session with Patty and I, is go through how examples like this toll road in Senegal show how the private sector is playing a much more important role in developing countries in particular, but not only in developing countries. We'll refer to the rest of the world as well, in terms of helping governments address their infrastructure gaps, in terms of being able to extend services to people that don't have them, make services available and of better quality, of more reliability, and help provide the kind of infrastructure that's needed to underpin economic growth and to help countries trade and create more employment. There are four main messages that we want to pass along as we go through here. One is that the role of the private sector, while it's come and gone over different decades depending on number of circumstances, in our view, over the next couple of decades is going to get much larger. And without an effective employment of the private sector as part of the solutions to infrastructure, the kind of gaps that you've seen, and we'll talk about again in a minute, are only going to get worse. The second thing that we'd like you to be able to remember out of this is there are clear trade-offs in terms of bringing the private sector in and using private capital, private management, private expertise alongside governments, alongside the public sector to deal with problems of infrastructure. But those trade-offs can be thought about, can be structured, and can be managed, and that's one of the things that we're going to try and leave you with. Thirdly, public-private partnerships, like the toll road example that we just started with in Senegal, are more and more an important part of the landscape. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that to help you think about it. They are not sort of the overall solution, but they're an increasingly important part of that. And fourth, if you're a government, if you're in public policy and you're trying to address infrastructure gaps, you're trying to get things put in place, it's complicated but can be done, and we'll give you a couple more examples of how that works. So one of the things you probably have already been talking about is what happens when you don't have enough infrastructure? What happens when your roads are of insufficient quality, you don't have enough power, you don't have enough electricity, your communication systems don't work, and so forth. What happens is, well, people aren't able to do a number of things, aren't able to achieve either quality of life in lower income countries, aren't able to find the kind of employment they want, aren't able to create additional economic value added, and help growth and increase in prosperity. A particular example here, Africa. This illustrates the different dimensions, or some of the different dimensions, of those gaps and how important they are, as you can see going through here. Insufficient roads, ports, railroads means that it costs roughly twice as much to move goods in Africa and from Africa to the rest of the world as it does in the rest of the world. Implication of that, lower competitiveness, fewer jobs, slower economic growth. The amount of the level of the population that has access to power, extremely low. Same with sanitation. And I won't go through each of these, but this gives you a sense of the multidimensionality of these gaps of infrastructure in a place like Africa, where these gaps are more extreme, but not unrepresentative of gaps that you find in the rest of the world. Here's a photo. Light doesn't quite work here, but I think you can still get the general gist of this. What does the world look like seen from a satellite at night? Some of you have probably seen this photo. It's a famous photograph that's used in a lot of different contexts. And the big thing to point out is you have Europe, you have Japan, you have mainly the eastern US. You can see an awful lot of lights. You can tell this is an old picture because up here in North Dakota you don't see all the flaring of the gas from the shale oil developments, which you would in current versions of this particular picture. But then you look at Africa, and what you see is very, very few lights. And same with a lot of other developing parts of the world. But this is another way to look at and to sort of make real what does it mean to have these infrastructure gaps and not to have infrastructure available. And again, you can go through a lot of statistics, whether on a country basis, whether on a regional basis, on a global basis, of what does it mean not to have this infrastructure, what is the size of these gaps, all of which have the same message, which is these gaps are extremely large. Same here in the United States as well. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And in each country, the nature of those gaps, which sectors it's worst in, varies. Each country is unique. Each country is different in terms of what it needs, what the priority problems are, and what can be done about them. But one thing is in common, with a possible exception of, since you just read Justin Liu's work, China is probably the only country in the world today that has enough infrastructure. In some cases, like airports, probably has too much of it. But in the rest of the world, infrastructure is a problem all around. So why is the private sector needed? What does the private sector bring to the party to help governments deal with these particular problems? And there's a number of different ways to think about it, but probably the simplest are, one, it's an issue of money, and two, beyond money, it's an issue of incentives, getting things done at a particular cost and getting things delivered on a reliable basis, and third, on an ongoing basis, ensuring that the quality of the services from infrastructure remain at an appropriate level. So on the money, one of the unique things about infrastructure and the important things about infrastructure when you're trying to deal with the problem of not having enough of it is it's very expensive. Infrastructure is probably, from a policymaker standpoint, the single biggest financial problem that the policymaker is going to face, just because of the sheer costs that are involved. A few orders of magnitude. In the US, anybody have a guess as to what some of the current estimates of the infrastructure gap in the US look like today? You get periodically these in newspapers, particularly around conversations of the infrastructure bank that has been sort of proposed in one way or another at least once a year for the last 3 to 4 years. I'm going to throw out a number. Yep. Right. 2 trillion. That's a pretty good guess. Yeah. 2 trillion. So 1 trillion, 1 trillion, 1 trillion and a half But pretty soon you're talking real money with amounts like that. So it's an awful lot of money involved in dealing with this. And that's a country like the U.S. Okay, the U.S. is huge. Numbers are much bigger here. But we go back to the example we just had of Senegal. Right? So in the case of Senegal, just building that toll road was about 1 to 2% of the size of the entire economy. In a country that also doesn't have enough electricity, is trying to build another airport, is trying to build a port and railroads to be able to transport goods in and out. So when you add these things together, the sheer size of the capital that's needed is overwhelming for a lot of countries. Another example of a country that both Patty and I do some work in right now is Guinea, just down the coast from Senegal. Guinea happens to have some of the richest reserves of undeveloped minerals in the world, particularly iron ore right now. And they're trying to develop that in order to create some economic growth, create more employment. The infrastructure involved in moving and developing iron ore and shipping it out to wherever, China or wherever it was going to go. Not the mining, just the infrastructure involved. The cost of that infrastructure is estimated, and pretty good estimates, about 5 times the size of the entire national economy. So again, just the sheer magnitude of the capital that's needed to deal with infrastructure problems is one of the biggest issues in terms of trying to move forward.
And Bernie, just to point out, I mean, of course, it's not just the construction of this infrastructure, but the maintenance of that infrastructure. And so when you talk about, if you think, in your own lives, your window breaks, you have to fix the window, you have to heat your house, you have to clean your room, you have to do all these things. All of that is extremely expensive. If you've driven on a road in Washington, D.C., even potholes, it's a significant cost, and it takes a lot of people to actually keep those things in good repair.
Mm-hmm. So taking the same issue from a regional standpoint, we'll look at sub-Saharan Africa. You have various estimates at how much infrastructure sub-Saharan needs to help develop and to address its various issues. Estimate from our colleagues at the World Bank is about $93 billion a year versus current spending of about half of that, $45 billion a year. So every year that goes by, the infrastructure problems in sub-Saharan Africa keep getting worse because of population growth and the need to maintain and the decline in existing infrastructure. So you have this gap of about $45 billion every year. And assuming you had a regional government, which you don't, what would the problem be in trying to address this? Well, first of all, you don't have the money yourself. Even if you were able to grow every year, let's say 10%, how much of the government money, government budget was available to spend on infrastructure, you might be able to come up with about another $3.5 billion. If you, as a number of governments in Africa do, can rely on donor money, on rich countries providing development aid, well, the problem is they're all running out of money. So development aid is actually declining from almost every country. I think Norway is probably the one exception right now where it's not currently declining. So maybe you turn to places like the World Bank or various international development banks. Well, the World Bank, which is by far the biggest of the international banks providing funding to Africa, and Africa is the place where it has the single largest infrastructure program anywhere in the world, provides $5 billion a year. So $5 billion, if you're working in the World Bank, looks like a lot of money. If you're in Africa trying to deal with the infrastructure problems, it's not a huge amount of money. So this is traditionally the first way to think about, so why do people turn to the private sector? The first place is to try and fill this particular gap. So these numbers here, so a gap of 45 billion, governments that can come up with maybe 3 to 5 billion, donors that on average today provide somewhere between 10 and 15 billion dollars to sub-Saharan Africa for all different types of issues altogether, $5 billion roughly for infrastructure out of the World Bank. Those numbers compare with how much money is, let's take an example, sitting in private equity and pension funds in the US, Japan, and Europe. Those numbers are well in excess of $1 trillion. And that money is looking for long-term investments, long-term assets to be invested in, of which infrastructure is a good example. So the private sector has a lot of money, and the public sector doesn't have a lot of money, is the easy way to think about what's the first reason why governments turn to the private sector to try and help deal with infrastructure-related issues. But it's not just the money. The other big thing with spending of infrastructure is issues with efficiency and ability to deliver services out of the public sector, which varies quite a lot depending on where you are. But several studies that have been done generally conclude that on average, the performance of governments in actually building themselves, the infrastructure and delivering it, tends to correlate with much higher risks of delays and much higher risks of cost overruns than contracting this out to the private sector. So you can see some studies here. We'll come back to some of the McKinsey and some other studies in some of the succeeding slides here. But a good example is very close to you here in Massachusetts. One of the most famous cases of public sector construction of infrastructure that didn't work the way it was intended was the Big Dig here, going out to the airport. And everybody knew when the Big Dig started and the new tunnel was going to be put in, everybody knew it was going to be very expensive, it was going to take a long time. Well, it wound up taking 7 years longer than what people had thought, which 7 years is quite a lot. And having gone to school in the area here, sometimes sitting, waiting in traffic at the old tunnel, waiting for the new tunnel to be put in, sometimes it seemed like you were there for 7 years. And the cost overrun, the additional costs that were incurred to build a tunnel relative to what was originally estimated, $20 billion. That's a lot of money, even for Boston.
Yeah.
So the first set of things in terms of the private sector coming in, one, the ability of the private sector to provide capital that the public sector doesn't have, and secondly, these issues of efficiency and being able to get things done on time. But the trade-offs are a bit more complex in terms of looking at this. So I'm going to turn to Pat to walk you through the next set here.
I just wanted to emphasize one of the last points that Bernie made, which is that the technical expertise and the capacity constraints on developing countries are significant, and there's more and more encouragement and pressure to work in the fragile and conflict-affected situations, not only at the World Bank but throughout the world. And those countries are particularly constrained in it's not intelligence, but it's actually governments that are functioning, enough people with expertise in the area, and actually to supervise the design and the implementation of these projects. So governments have, looking at the trade-offs that a government might be considering when it's thinking about how to handle its infrastructure gap. And I think Professor Joyce talked to you a little bit about what's a piece of infrastructure that might be a public good and what might be something that's more, I guess I don't know the economic terms so well, I'm not an economics major, but what might be something where you can have users pay for the services they're getting. And I guess I'd like to sort of distinguish between the infrastructure gap and something that might be used as much as possible by the most people and how that gets financed. So the government may have, the major overarching choices will be, do we try to figure out how to raise the money and publicly procure the infrastructure that's required? And let's decide which of the most, as Bernie was saying, which is the piece of infrastructure or the pieces of infrastructure that are going to have the biggest economic impact if we address them right away. Now remember, some of these countries, people don't have clean water just to drink, let alone to use for manufacturing. They don't have roads to get to work, you heard, but they don't have roads to get their goods to market. So there's so much need, and the government has to figure out what are the priorities, what is the kind of business that might, in the end, be able to attract a private investor who wants to make a return on his investment. So the government's looking broadly at public procurement versus bringing in the private sector. And we're just going to run through a couple of the trade-offs the government might think of, concerns that they might have in bringing in the private private investment. And you can see here, some countries, I mean, it might be perfectly acceptable to accept what's the status quo. Maybe there's not a significant pressure from the population to improve a particular piece of infrastructure or business or service. And yet, in most of the countries, and you can see this throughout small rebellions and strikes and things like that, there are huge political pressures on the government itself to deliver affordable, reliable, quality services to the most people, and to justify the rewards to the private sector in delivering those services can sometimes be very difficult for a government to argue to its population. So it's one big, sort of overarching concern. Is it worth it to bring in the private sector? There are different views on most of these issues, but a government might think bringing in the private sector to even just finance the construction and operation of an asset will require it to yield control over that asset to the private sector. And to some extent, that's very, very true. Most investors, if they're putting in the most money and putting their most of their money at risk, are not going to want the government to retain control or ownership over the asset and how the business is run. So that's a big concern, and governments can be under a lot of pressure to yield control to the private sector over things like water supply or like delivery of power. To whom? Who gets the power? Who gets hospital services? Is it the rich people or is it not? So there's a lot of issues around control. If you bring in the private sector and you're trying to get the private sector to invest in the construction or operation or be involved as a manager of a business, the inefficiencies in the existing management of a utility and its finances, its technical operations come under scrutiny. And that sometimes can be very powerful. I mean, it's not just specific to the developing world. Of course, in the developed world, there's always a little bit of a resistance to have how things are currently operated come under public scrutiny, even though, of course, in our country, there's a lot of, in the US, I mean, there's a lot of freedom to bring such things under scrutiny. And the private sector in general, we'll come back to this in a little bit, will not want to assume risks of running that business that are not under its control. And we'll come back to that a little bit. So there might be a lot of pressure on a government to assume risks of a particular business and infrastructure asset that the private sector is not willing to bear. And the government has to come to terms a lot with what the political climate of the country is. So, for example, if there has been, we work, Bernie and I, a lot in Kenya. Kenya's making amazing strides. They have lots of private investment in various bits of the infrastructure sectors and so on. And yet, the bombing in the mall really is a bit of a shock. And investors are very concerned about that kind of event. And the country has to be pretty honest with itself about how to manage that kind of perception of risk by the private sector. So there's sort of more climate, and those are sort of big picture issues. In terms of feasibility, whether the government has to figure out, and I'll come to more specifics on this, how to finance the project. And if let's just take any particular bit of infrastructure, if it decides it wants to do the public procurement and pay off its balance sheet, its public financial balance sheet, it will need to figure out how to get the money. And I'll come back to some specifics about how it can do that, and Bernie's referred to some as well. But if it decides to do the private route and the private investors and operators are going to be run this particular asset, of course the private sector is going to be thinking, how do I charge for this? The government could actually pay that investor. And a lot of road projects, I think Professor Joyce and I talked about this a little bit last year, but a road project might be structured so that the operator is paid by the government. Or there might be tolls, so the private investors pay the operator of the road directly. So if the government decides, let me think about this private sector possibility, the government needs to be able to think about whether users will pay. And there's all sorts of, when we do a private investment, there's all sorts of due diligence we do on whether the market will bear, can and will bear the cost of paying a toll for a road, for example. If there's alternatives, there's many, many different cases of toll roads that have been unsuccessful because people just say, forget about the toll, I'm going to take this slow road over here. So the government has to say, well, okay, if the people won't pay for the service, a private sector option is probably not realistic. If the private sector will pay for some or all of it, the private sector or PPP option may be possible, but it might be difficult. And of course, if the private sector is willing and able to pay, and of course we will come back to affordability issues, then a private option is available. So the government's constantly weighing, is this the industry I want to do as a public option or a private option? Do I want to do something in between? What will the users be able to and willing to pay? In terms of non-financial issues, so not commercial viability, the government might need to think also about what we have as cross-jurisdictional issues. We've got a lot of encouragement, and there's a lot of focus on doing regional projects now. So many projects involve several countries. Just like in the United States, you might involve 2 different states. I always think about the Tennessee Valley Authority and how that project might have gotten done. But a project I worked on a couple of years ago involved bringing power from Tajikistan to Pakistan over a very long transmission line. It's actually still under development. But even if the Pakistan government has decided, okay, I'm going to do this private sector option, I'm going to buy this power, that comes from 4 countries over, because it's going to still be cheaper than if I do a public sector option at home or use private sector. There's all sorts of private options in Pakistan too. But are they really going to be in control over getting the Tajik country and the businesses there to cooperate? Can they manage the land issues and how to establish the right of way of that transmission line across these countries?
We use a bit of a rule of thumb that for every additional government that's involved in putting infrastructure together, it's twice as complicated.
Yeah.
So you're basically going through an equation of, at what point is it too much trouble to go this route?
Right. And there's this question of sovereignty. On this project I was talking about, every single country wanted to maintain and be in control over the transmission line in its country. Well, that makes sense, right? No country wants to say the Tajik government doesn't want the Afghanistan, country to take control over that piece of infrastructure. And there are environmental and social concerns. So if you do a project involving the World Bank or some of the other banks and development finance institutions that adopt our environmental and social safeguards, you will need to do a lot of public consultation to ensure that the design and the implementation and operation of the project is acceptable to the large communities that are affected by the project. And that can be a big concern to the government. If I bring in the private sector, will that help on those issues or will it hinder? In terms of transparency, even if the country decides to do the public sector option, so the typical idea would be just like if you were doing an addition on your home, you bid out for someone to build the addition on your house, and the bids come in, and you look at the lowest cost, and you sort of decide to go with that option. In a lot of countries, it doesn't work exactly like that. The public procurement and the tendering is not the natural way to go about things. Some of the countries are very small, and there's local industry that would expect to, who know the local minister who decide that they would like to build a particular piece of infrastructure. It's not considered untoward. There's nothing wrong with it per se. And yet transparency issues have to be considered in going that route.
So transparency, for those who need a translation, is a polite way to talk about corruption, right? So which is probably more prevalent in infrastructure, again, because of the amounts of money involved than lots of other lots of other things.
And this is very interesting. I mean, the government has to think, well, will I be able to attract investors and operators, private sector, to do this particular project, build it, operate it on affordable terms? Even if they're doing a privatization, which is to say the complete sale of a business like electricity generation to the private sector, or maybe they want a private manager of their distribution company, like what do you have here, Pepco? No, what's the local electricity distribution company? and Stark, even if you wanted to have a private manager of that company for many different reasons, and they bid out to sell that entire business to a private sector company, some of those are not successful because a private company from another country or even the local country may be very concerned about the costs involved in running that business, and so they make a very expensive bid to the government to run that business, or there might be one bidder. So the attracting of investors actually cannot be successful, and that can actually have a knock-on effect to further private investors being interested in working in that sector in that country. And as I said before, the government needs to consider what kinds of support it needs to give to the private sector, especially for things that are under the control of the government, or at least not under the control of the private sector, like sabotage and terrorism, or like, strikes.
Well, there's also much simpler ones, which is, will there be enough money to pay the equivalent of tariffs or whatnot? Right. Which, if you follow renewable energy and you follow what has been happening in Europe, the controversies in Europe around solar energy in Spain, wind energy in Germany in particular, this is, if you go back one, Pat, so this issue of which has become highly controversial was the support that was given at the outset. It was considered cheaper in terms of bringing the private sector in to say, well, we'll just guarantee you a certain price, irrespective of what else is going on, if you deliver wind power or solar power in that particular case. And where the prices were actually set turned out to be much higher than what was needed for the amount of energy the systems could absorb, in particular in Germany and Spain. So the governments have had to, in the last year, walk backwards with great negative publicity and all sorts of fiscal trauma, walk away from the contracts they had given to solar and wind producers in the two countries because they could no longer afford the guarantees that they had provided, the payment guarantees they had provided at the outset.
One of the issues that comes up almost in every single transaction, at least that I've worked on, maybe Bernie, you've had this experience too, is the Ministry of Finance. So the government's sort of comprised of many different ministries and secretaryships or whatever, and the Minister of Finance is managing the budget of the country, and yet the Ministry of Energy is handling the electricity, or the Ministry of Transport is handling the road and the rail business and so on. So the Ministry of Finance may come quickly to the conclusion, well, we don't have the money. We need to engage with the private sector. And yet the Minister of Energy, or the Minister of Transport, doesn't want to be under public scrutiny. They like it's very personal in many cases. It's not necessarily, as I say, it's not transparent, but they like running that business. They are important people in their country, and they may not want to have any change. I don't think this is unique to developing countries. And so very often we come across a situation where the ministries are at odds, and so it's an impasse, and it's very difficult to move further, whether the public procurement option or the private sector option, if there's not a consensus within the government. And of course we have that in our country as well, on many different issues. Public opinion definitely varies country by country, and depending upon who the private sector might be that's going to be implementing the infrastructure. So a lot of times if it's a local company, that might be perfectly fine. If it's a foreign investor, some people are a little concerned, especially around the kinds of infrastructure that involve water or hospitals. Who's going to run this infrastructure? Can we trust that they're going to do it for the benefit and affordably to the users of that infrastructure? So that can be a bit of a lightning rod politically. Will just private investment in general be turned into a political issue? This government was unable to deliver the infrastructure. They've been promising X for years, and they finally had to get the private sector, especially these foreigners, to do this work. And as we were saying earlier, and Bernie was just alluding to, will the users be willing and able to pay? I worked on a project a number of years ago where the whole financial structure of the project, it was for electricity distribution, was fantastic. But what was not accounted for was that the the people were actually willing to pay, but they had no experience of paying, and there was no system of collection and cutting off people who were not collecting. So there wasn't really a culture of paying for some of these services. So that can be, one of the things the government needs to consider. And as I say, of course, we're looking, especially at the World Bank Group, to make the biggest impact and affect the most people by the delivery of infrastructure services. And yet, not everybody. Some people might be able to pay, and some people may not. Industry may be able to pay, but residential consumers in a particular area not. Rural areas that are not really connected to urban areas can be very difficult and expensive to provide infrastructure for, and yet those people need to be taken into account also. So the government's thinking about all these different things. What's the best option? Maybe I'll do the rural areas as a public option, but I'll do the urban as private. So it's a lot of different considerations as they are trying to figure out private or public or some combination. And then we talked a little bit earlier about the community issues, and especially relating as the Dakar toll road project involved the resettlement and relocation of some families. Well, it turns out those families were pretty happy. I don't know if you saw the video I sent around as a preparatory to the class, but those people were pretty happy with the solution, but it's not always the case. So these are considerations. And one of the things we often come across in the projects we're working on is, you think you've developed a project for a long time with your counterparts, and maybe in the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Transport, everybody agrees, and then there's an election, and you have to start all over. People are thinking about it again. So these are real, serious implementation, practical concerns on the ground. Oops. Bernie, why don't you talk about this slide, because it's one that you've provided.
Sure. This is just to reinforce the point that was made earlier about transparency and about trying to build political consensus and how you achieve this. This is a polling group based in Peru, which is famous for having some of the best series of polls on infrastructure and privatization related issues that one can lay one's hands on. So, and this particular summary really illustrated an important point here. It was more focused on privatization rather than private delivery of infrastructure per se, but the numbers are the numbers hold across both, which is if when population in Peru was polled in general, what do you feel about private delivery of public services? Not much support. On the other hand, if they're asked the same question, they say, well, there's going to be a transparent process before private companies are brought in. Well, more than half the people say, well, no, this is actually okay. And on top of it, if they are told, well, actually, how much you're going to pay for the service is going to be regulated by the government, again, support creeps up. And if they're told, well, there's going to be very specific added benefits of having these private companies involved, again, opinions change. So it's just a nice illustration of how the parts about bringing in the private sector is not just about getting the capital involved, but actually delivering improved services, and how it is done, the process by which it's done, matters a lot in terms of the political sustainability of the contract.
So just a few more issues from the government perspective, but I want to talk briefly about the private sector also, because it's important. So we talked about, the government has to figure out, even if they decide to go to the public procurement option, I'm going to pay for the whole thing off of the public budget. They have to figure out where to get the funds to, and you heard about the magnitude of the amount, not only for the construction, but for the ongoing operation. So they could raise taxes like they do in a lot of developed countries. Some countries have zero system for taxation, or people are unable to afford it. So that works. We tend to distinguish between middle-income countries and the poorer, lesser developed countries. So some countries, don't really have that as a viable option, or they can raise a little bit of money through that. I'm talking about taxes not only on residents, but on industry and so on. If there's not a lot of industry, there's nobody paying the hefty taxes. Or that we could charge user fees, and we talked a little bit about whether there's an ability and a willingness of users of infrastructure to pay for that. They might be a lucky country and have resources that they can export, like Guinea, as Bernie was saying, or they might have geothermal resources or oil or something. They might have mines for special metals that are used throughout all the electronics products. And so they might be one of those lucky countries that can manage to sell those resources. And in fact, they usually sell them outside their countries for foreign exchange, which is really critical to the country. I'm sure Professor Joyce can talk more knowledgeably about that. But it really is important to have a foreign currency basis and reserves. Or it might, as Bernie was saying, you might have bilateral or multilateral concessional loans from the World Bank. I'm still talking about the public sector option. So the government is on the hook to repay a loan. And they might be concessional terms if it's one of the poorer countries that can be paid out over a very long period of time. And yet it's on the balance sheet of that country. And those kinds of foreign exchange obligations are measured by the IMF, for example, and by the World Bank. And of course, the leverage of that country is really important. You can't just keep on borrowing. Some countries might have actually securities markets and be able to raise money in the bond market. But that's not really true for the fragile and conflict-affected states or for the very poorest countries. We talked about charitable contributions. It might be a stopgap measure. But believe it or not, even charitable organizations have their own mission statements. They are very specific about what they want to invest in. They have a need to be able to report back to people who are contributing to those charities and explain what's happening to the money. It's not just a sinkhole. So that's not exactly a sustainable system, so far. And increasingly, I'm sure you've seen, well, of course, the Chinese, the Brazilians, even the Indians, the Middle Eastern countries are becoming more, I called it non-traditional bilateral donors or investors and so on. That can be fantastic. As everybody knows, the Chinese, both the state-owned entities as well as the country, are investing heavily in Africa. That can be a fantastic source of capital. And yet, the balance of the rights and obligations of those non-traditional bilateral donors can be really important. Increasingly, I would say that a lot of those bilateral donors are doing better in terms of quality of delivery of those services, as well as meeting some of the really important environmental and social safeguards policies that are really critical to doing infrastructure correctly and in a good quality for developing countries. Bringing in the private sector, the government is always going to be thinking, especially if you do, not the privatization specifically, but a PPP option, where the public and the private sectors are going to be cooperating. It can appear to be an upfront, lengthy, and costly process. Engaging with the private sector, there's lots of different kinds of stakeholders. There's investors, just plain old investors like pension funds. There are operators. There are companies that want to sell their equipment. All of these engagements, there are lenders, there's commercial lenders, development finance institutions. Structuring the transaction can appear to be extremely expensive and time-consuming, and is. And yet, the costs of that can be, if it's well-structured, compensated over time through a well-structured, balanced project that's meant to be sustainable over the long term in terms of rights and obligations of each of the public and private sector stakeholders. I talked a little bit about earlier, does the public sector, they have to be asking themselves, do we have the capacity to design a proper tender in terms of the design of this project? Do we have the capacity to oversee the construction of the project and the ongoing operation? It's a huge constraint in many countries. And let's just go on one more time. I just want to quickly touch on this, and then we'll move into, I think, a little bit more about the PPP structure of a transaction. What would be, kind of, there's no black and white template for doing a PPP, but there's some issues that Bernie will go through too. The private sector, on the other hand, so we talked about the public sector. What are their, the trade-offs they're thinking about? If I do this, if I involve the private sector, it might involve that. If I don't, what's the impact on my resources, financial and my technical resources? The private sector, on the other hand, people are in business. They're not typically, charities that are interested in just investing out of the goodness of their heart. They have shareholders, even companies that are not actual public companies need to be able to make money to be able to exist into the future and invest in many different things and then reinvest their monies and so on. So the private sector is typically looking at how do I justify this particular investment in a business in this particular country? What are the risks of doing this project? How do I price that risk? And you may have heard, not so much in economics, but typically a lender, when they're looking at a project, they are among the first entities to be paid as the business starts making money. So the business is paying its operating costs first, its construction and then operating costs, and it's paying its lenders. It's very high up in the waterfall of payments. And the lenders are pricing their loans, just like if you were getting a mortgage on a house, your parents are getting a mortgage on a house. And the lender is thinking about what are the risks involved in this project. I have to take into account not only the risks of this actual business, but the country and political risks. So they're thinking of their interest rate as reflecting the risks involved in that project. And then the investors, the shareholders and the equity investors are thinking the returns that I hope to make on this project have to reflect the risks I'm taking in this project. And they have to think about lots of different things. They're also looking at evaluating the business and the potential for things going wrong and getting in the way of their generating revenues. Now, the investors are typically willing to take the risks that are in their control, but not really other risks, as I mentioned earlier. So I've just listed here a few of the things that might be things that the private sector says, well, I'm not in control of that. I don't really want to go into this country when I have these other options if there's going to be a change in the ruling government that changes the rules of the game. Or I don't want to go into a regulatory environment where there's a cap on my returns, even though this is typically infrastructure is a regulated return, regulated business in terms of tariffs that are charged. Excessive foreign exchange devaluation can really cut into the investors, and you probably talked a little bit about that. And typically infrastructure services are paid in local currency, but obligations to contractors and to lenders might be in foreign exchange, so that could be a significant risk for a business. Expropriation. I'm sure you've seen some of the news over the years in I don't know, Venezuela, where we have some recent expropriations that are a risk that the private sector is thinking, I shouldn't take that risk. The government should assure me and buy me out if I'm going to be involved in this business. I'm willing to go into the country and do the things that are in my control, maintain my equipment, build on time, build quality, and so on. But that's not in my control. Neither is war, sabotage, or terrorism. And actually, it's interesting because in the negotiations that we're involved in mostly, the government may reasonably say, well, some of those things are not in my control either. So why should I take that risk? I'm not in control if I'm invaded by, in the case I'll talk about a little bit later, a Maoist rebellion.
That's when the lawyers get well paid, Patty.
Yeah, but it's a kind of risk that the private sector is trying to figure out. They're trying to understand. They do extensive evaluation of the business as well as the country environment, and try to, at a minimum, identify the risks. If not, maybe they don't eliminate the risk by just imposing on the government, but they have to figure out how to manage it or price it into their business. And as the last point was something that was near and dear to my heart, which was if in a public-private partnership, and Bernie will talk more about it, where the risks are allocated, among the various stakeholders and so on, each of the players wants to kind of push risks off on the other guy, and there's a consequence to doing that. But if the government, on the one hand, wants to push as many risks as possible onto the private sector, the private sector might be willing to take a few of these risks, but the more the private sector is forced to take risks that are beyond its control, the more they may say, too complicated, I'm going elsewhere. And so there is a competition for financial and other resources and so it's a delicate balance for a country making these decisions. There you go.
So you have now, between these two sections, the bulk of the substance that we wanted to pass along in terms of sort of why the private sector gets involved and some of the trade-offs to look at in here. There's a couple useful things to also carry away in terms of in terms of PPPs we want to leave you with. Okay, I didn't realize we had animation on this one. But I want to get to our closing example that Patty will give you on Nepal in a second. So in PPPs, just it's useful if you're going to be involved in infrastructure to be aware of this. This is a term that has become quite fashionable over the last 10 years. And covers really a broad range of different types of approaches that involve, again, both government and the private sector together rather than just one excluding the other. You can get any number of definitions that you want of what PPPs are. This just gives you one way to approach it. I like to think of it as the simplest way. Again, it's just you've got the private sector coming in with some combination of capital expertise or technology, and the government with some combination of regulation or guarantees or capital as it may be. Again, multiple combinations can be looked at. This has become extremely widespread in the last decade plus, starting in particular the UK. In the post-Thatcher years, this became the main form of procuring infrastructure and putting in place infrastructure in the UK. From there, it spread to a number of other countries, beginning in Europe, and then across emerging markets. A number of middle-income countries, now increasingly lower-income countries, have picked this up. And actually, one of the countries that has been the slowest to pick this up, but one of the fastest growing now, is actually the US. Where this form of procurement is not being used so much at the federal level, but increasingly in a number of states, including Joanne and I are both Virginians. Virginia is actually one of the fastest growing states for adopting this type of approach. So more and more, as you go, if you are involved or you're listening to public policy about putting infrastructure in place, you're going to hear about PPPs. One of the biggest attractions of PPPs, again, comes back to the capital issue. And this is just a different way to look at it. If I'm just doing traditional public sector infrastructure, my problem is all of the money I have to come up with up front. Plus, I've got the risks that I talk about that either it costs more or it takes longer to put in place. And then on top of that, I need some money on an ongoing basis. As opposed to most PPPs now, the government isn't actually paying until something's delivered. So the government gets to postpone spending money, which is good. Many governments, it occurs to them that the construction phase and when payment starts coincides with the next election. So it's the next government that's going to have to worry about coming up with the money. This is always a good thing from many politicians' perspectives. But the issue then is whether this set of payments over here is less than that one on a real value basis. And that's generally what most studies conclude looking at PPPs and procurement, private procurement of infrastructure, is in fact that cost overruns and delivery tends to be much better with private involvement. This is an extensive study done out of the UK that came up with these numbers. You have other studies that have similar types of constructions. Again, there are different types of forms. We don't need to spend a lot of time on the different forms today, but they range from the simplest, which are out here, service contracts, where the government is simply bringing in private operation, but otherwise maintaining all the risks and the need to put the money in place, all the way out here to full divestiture, where the investors are essentially coming up with everything you need, and all sorts of structures that come in between. Risk allocation can as laid out by Pat before, be thought about in a fairly structured way, and the types of PPPs that one comes up with reflects the objectives that you have in terms of who gets allocated what risks. Number of positives in terms of the experience now that's been built up. They have been huge factors in a number of countries in terms of making improvements on infrastructure deficits, including across a number of developing countries. But they are not, as we see out here on the other side of this slide, they are not the silver bullet solution to solving everything. There have been a number of high-profile problems, a couple in emerging markets that we've listed here. In the developed world, probably the single most visible example of a failure of a public-private partnership scheme is the Eurotunnel between France and the UK. which has failed rather spectacular from a financial standpoint. And as Pat was talking about, it's very expensive to put these in place. It takes quite a while to lay out the contracts. You have to pay the lawyers an awful lot in order to get the results that you want. Yes, so Pat likes that part, but not necessarily all the government budget people. So we're going to close with one example here that Pat will run us through on Nepal.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I mean, and I'm so glad that Purana has come too, because we'll be touching on some, do you all know Purana? Who was not only an Albright Institute fellow last year, but worked at IFC on the advisory side of IFC last summer. And so she has some really interesting perspectives on supporting the government in making some of these decisions, what we were talking about, and assessing the trade-offs. So I just wanted to talk about, just to pull out some of the principles and the issues we've talked about. Bernie and I also, we worked a lot together on many different things, but in Nepal, I wanted to just give the context first and then talk about some of the issues that the government was considering, as well as the private sector investors and stakeholders who were considering investing in Nepal. So there's a relatively limited history of private sector involvement in infrastructure, even though probably 15 years ago I worked on the two first independent power projects in Nepal, two small run-of-the-river hydro projects, which were basically successful, but it didn't lead to much more because of some political turmoil in the country. And so the second point was, it is a post-conflict country with some continuing political and country risks. At a minimum, it's what the private market sees in the country, and is concerned about and weighing as they're considering their options for which country do I go into, which business is the most sure to make a return, that kind of thing. And for the time being, there's a reliance on dirty and expensive alternatives to their significant hydropower resources. And I can tell you from having been in Nepal, whenever that was in, where are we now? In January, so in October, it's pretty dirty still, especially in Kathmandu. And of course, like many countries, there's this huge push toward urbanization, even though much of the country is agrarian. So the government appropriately has ambitious plans for exploitation of their main resource, which is really hydropower. And particularly, they're considering, not exploiting sounds like a bad word, but it's not really, they're trying to develop their hydropower resources not only to solve their domestic needs for power with a view toward helping the economy grow and businesses grow and so on, but they are sure that if they export this hydropower potential to Bhutan, to India, to other countries in the area, that they will be able to use those the revenues to support the growth of their economy. So it's perhaps, I was told by the country manager for the World Bank while I was there, that the two main resources, is anybody from Nepal here? Okay, well anyway, the two main resources from in Nepal, I was told, were the hydropower resources and the manpower, the labor. And so the hydropower are the ones that really make the biggest bang for the country's buck. So they're really fixated on how best to exploit those resources. Again, also considering the public versus the private sector options. And yet, even if they develop their hydropower generation resources, there's limited distribution and transmission systems. If they were to exploit the export potential of the country, they've got to figure out how to get this power to the other countries surrounding with significant transmission lines. I'm sure you've all seen those high power tension lines and so on. While that's not as expensive as building a hydropower project, it's still expensive and it has to be planned, and you have these cross-jurisdictional issues and treaties among countries that need to be developed. So the government's sort of having to weigh those put those into the mix also. And it's a very poor population, so when we talk about affordability, that's a significant concern of the government as they consider how to especially deal with the domestic projects. The regulatory environment is not so bad. There's a private regulator. There are regulations for how to tender to private sector to be involved in the power sector industry, and there's even tariff regulations that give investors some idea of the kinds of returns they might be able to make by investing in that project. And yet, Bernie mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think, so in many countries, there's only one distributor of electricity. So the private sector can be involved in generation of power, but not distribution to industry and to residences. And that's the case in Nepal. So there's no competition. There's a single government-owned entity, NEA, Nepal Energy, which has great people. They're all doing the right thing and so on. And yet, it's not managerially, technically, or financially, sound at the moment. And that would be the purchaser of all of the power that's being produced for domestic use. And the government capacity, it's a small government. It's constrained to figure out the right design and so on. So what we tried to figure out is what's the best way that the World Bank can work with the government to support it in exploiting these resources. Now, the World Bank of course doesn't do this on its own. We have there's many excellent regional banks, the Asian Development Bank in this case. There's bilateral development finance institutions that we partner with constantly, as well as private stakeholders. So just a quick summary. I think there's always, whenever we talk about the World Bank Group, I think there's a little bit of confusion over what it means. And maybe you've studied this in your classes, but just to be perfectly clear, we are 5 different legal entities, and we have different ways we, one, collaborate, but engage to support countries in developing their resources. So the World Bank, so-called World Bank, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, really basically lends to governments of middle-income countries and provides sector and policy advice, what we sort of loosely call upstream advice, like what kinds of policies should we use? Should we promote the private sector in this particular industry? Should we not? What kinds of regulatory regime should we have? So that's the World Bank itself does that. And then I'm just going to skip to the middle column, which is International Development Association, which does exactly the same kinds of things, but for the poorest countries, the so-called IDA countries. And then IFC was formed, and by the way, the World Bank was formed after World War II to help rebuild the infrastructure of Europe, specifically because the infrastructure was considered integral to economic development in Europe. And IFC invests and advises to promote the private sector part of infrastructure, and we have lots of other business lines, agribusiness and financial markets and so on. But the important thing for IFC is that we don't accept government guarantees of our loans or investments, so we're taking full commercial risk on our projects. And then ICSID is a dispute resolution body that's related to us, and MIGA, Multilateral Investment Guaranteed Agency, as well as the World Bank, actually provide political risk protection and regulatory risk protection with specific financial instruments they can offer. And so what we decided to do was to try to use all of the different arms of the World Bank to support the Nepal government in planning how to exploit these significant resources. By the way, it's billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that would be built, and I forget how many thousands of megawatts of power that would be delivered, but it's a significant program, and there's a lot of support for Nepal exploiting these resources. So on the government capacity side, and I'm going to return to Purana briefly for this, what we ended up doing was trying to figure out how to get technical assistance money for the government to retain advisors who would advise them on not only the trade-offs we talked about, like should we do this or should we do that, but what is the global best practice and how to allocate risks among the private sector and the public sector. We and some other development finance institutions put together money so they could have technical and financial advisors as well as legal advisors. There are lots of consultancies, including IFC, which can be retained by governments to help them figure out how to tender to the private sector and get the most competent, experienced, credit-worthy sponsor that can stay involved and who's committed to staying involved over the long haul to run these complex businesses. And so in this case, IFC was not involved as an advisor, but the advisors that we helped fund helped to find a bunch of different investors. Now, there's many different projects that are being built, so it's not just one massive several billion-dollar project, but there's probably 10 different hydropower projects, at least, something like that, that are being built at the same time. And each one has a different set of investors and different operators and so on. So it can be pretty complex to manage all of that. And then one of the things that I enjoy doing, so in October, some colleagues and I went to sit with the government and the utility and the investment arm of the Ministry of Finance just to sit down and give them some candid feedback, not project specific, on what we were seeing in the markets globally about how projects might be structured to be cost effective for the government, affordable to the private sector, give them, each of the public and the private sector players incentives to be involved and to stay involved over the life of these projects. And IFC actually, one of the main things we do, Bernie was giving some of the figures on if the World Bank Group invests $5 billion per year in Africa. One of the main things we do also, though, is mobilize equity and debt financing to support these substantial projects. So that's a significant part of our business. I forget what the statistic is now. For every dollar we invest, we raise...
About 1 to 1.
1 to 1, okay. The important thing, I think, also in the olden days, I think there's also a misconception of the World Bank's clout with governments. It may have been long ago that the World Bank could go into a country and say, do this, do this, do that. But first of all, the governance of the World Bank is very different now. There's not just a decision by developed countries on how to address and decide on which projects to invest in, nor are governments willing to just do what they're told to do. These are sovereign countries. They have their own complex governments and political processes and cultures and so on. And yet, when we're involved in a project, they can be relatively sure that our environmental and social safeguards policies are implemented, which is really critical, especially with investors who might have different agendas for why they're being involved in the country. And even where we're not involved in a project, at least the government has heard what the gold standard is in environmental and social safeguards, how to include the public in designing and implementing the projects, and on transparency issues too. And one of the things that we've done also is to work on a couple of specific projects that we think, if we can, and my arm of what I do now is work on the project development side, which is to help structure projects so that they really reflect a good and sustainable balance of the risks and the rewards of the project across from the private to the public sector, so that they can be replicated and they include our standards. So one of the things we see ourselves as doing a significant contribution to our member countries is that they are learning what the best standard would be, even if we're not actually involved in every project. And we can't be, because we have to make choices across industries and our countries also. And as I mentioned earlier, the political risks of the project, or the risks that are not in the control of the private sector is really worrying about. Like, what if the guy that's the utility that's supposed to be buying the power that I produced is bankrupt? What do I do then? What if the regulations change? What if there's something outside the control of the private sector and the public sector? And MIGA and the World Bank provide certain financial instruments that will guarantee investors to be repaid in the case that some of those events occur and interrupt the flow of revenues that would otherwise go to repay those investors and lenders. I think it would be worth stopping here, actually. And Purana, if you could take 2 minutes, if you don't mind, and just say what you were doing on the advisory side for IFC.
Hi, everyone. I'm Prerna. Like Patty said, I was an Institute Fellow last winter session, and I worked at the International Finance Corporation for my Albright internship. Stand up, okay. And I guess the work that I did was on the advisory services side of IFC. So basically, I was in one of the teams that was working with these member governments who wanted to implement different kinds of projects to meet different development goals. Specifically, the work that I did was kind of in the areas of health and education, so a little bit different from infrastructure, but it was the same kind of work.
We call that social infrastructure and traditional infrastructure. It's definitely infrastructure.
Still infrastructure. So the team that I was on, basically a government would approach the team, or the team would work with the country managers in that area on a certain question or problem that they were facing or goal they wanted to reach, and kind of come up with one of these transaction structures, a PPP idea for how could we leverage both the private sector expertise as well as the public sector expertise to meet that goal, and then move forward from there to help them in going through the tender process, getting a bidder, et cetera, et cetera. So the work I did was more research-based. I was looking at different types of public-private partnerships in education and how the public-private partnership structure can be used in the space of education in these different countries, including the United States. So not all the work I did was in emerging countries, to really reach some of the development goals related to education that the World Bank and a lot of other development organizations have targeted as very important.
Thank you.
Great.
So we had takeaways, but basically, you want to wrap up?
No, I think we're good with the wrap up. I don't want
Okay,
why don't we
good.
go to.
I do want to leave some. I know there's only 10 minutes, 7 minutes, although we're going to be around for a little bit, and I will arrange for the slides to come to you so you can have. There's some statistics at the back about with some figures that might be useful for your project. So hopefully, and at least I'm perfectly happy to answer questions or emails or whatever as you're doing your research and if you have some questions. But okay, so what wasn't clear? Should we start over? No. Yes.
Me here to speak with us. I have a question, which is, I was wondering if either of you can offer some insights as to how we can address infrastructure needs in countries that are politically unstable. As I understand it, those are big risks for the private sector to take on, and often in those countries, the government is unable to fulfill a lot of those needs. Yet infrastructure, as you mentioned with the World Bank, is, really important in terms of stabilizing countries and moving countries forward post-conflict.
Great, be happy to do that. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we can address them. Yeah, I have some over here.
Thank you for coming to speak today. I was just, first a point of clarification. PPPs, the governments wouldn't have to pay anything back until the services are provided. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
That's one of there are lots of different
part of it.
flavors. Right?
Okay,
That's
so
one, yeah.
I was just wondering, I don't know too much about this, but I was wondering if there would be an analogy made between like individual people and credit cards, like paying for credit cards and then not being able to pay it off at a certain point, if governments would be at a similar risk, if that would be a valid analogy.
Good, thank you.
Human behavior has lots of constants. Yeah, absolutely. Talk about that one. So, want to pick up one more here? One more right there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. You guys mentioned public opinion and public consensus, and I was wondering if you could maybe provide any examples from your own experiences in which you thought a government and the private contractor with whom they were working did a particularly good job of getting the public on board in what might have otherwise been a very controversial project.
Yeah, sure.
Good. Do you want to?
I'm happy to talk to any of those.
Okay,
you want
go
to
ahead. Why not? I can always just.
Want to go ahead and Pat, if you want to add.
Since he's my client, he gets to do anything he wants.
Let me start with the first one real quick. I think in terms of political instability and trying to build infrastructure in countries that have that issue. So 3 points I would make here. The first one is clearly it's a big issue, and there are a number of countries where political instability simply means you're not going to be able to get the private sector to come in and build infrastructure. So there are one block of countries that looks like that. Argentina, for example, today, almost impossible to get any kind of private investment involved in infrastructure because of the track record they've built up. That said, political instability covers a wide spectrum from wholesale rescission of contracts and walking away, as has been the case of the nationalization, has been the case of Argentina, to smaller levels of political instability, which might include electoral cycles where new governments come in and say, well, I'm going to basically chip away at a particular agreement, or I'm going to delay payments, or I'm going to do a number of things that come short of, let's say, the Argentine experience. So that is where, again, you pay the lawyers the big bucks to come in and design contracts that have all sorts of risk mitigation measures in place to try and allocate those risks in the way that Patty had walked through. And thirdly, you have some specific instruments that are available, some from the World Bank Group, as Patty mentioned, some from private sector providers of political risk insurance that target very specific things like breach of contracts, like expropriation and so forth. So there are different ways to approach it, but certainly political instability does not correlate well with building new infrastructure. The credit card analogy.
Wait, before you go there,
Yeah?
I was just going to say, in terms of those are kinds of things that may or may not be within the control of the government. I worked on a project in Balochistan in Pakistan many years ago. It's not a very stable area. And what ended up happening, there was a very, I think it was actually a consortium of investors that were interested in building and operating that project, and they had a security system around the whole thing, and it actually did pretty well. Cote d'Ivoire is an amazing example of there having been a civil war, and the operations never stopped on this particular independent power project. In some cases, what we've done is where it's really simply dangerous to physically be in a country, we've supported financial institutions that are in the country, which then support local companies that then build out, maybe not in the significant size we've done, but to keep things going. I think we were one of the first institutions that got involved in Iraq a couple of years ago. We worked through one of the local banks to try to support and keep things moving as the country was kind of sort of recovering.
Yeah. So just on the other two questions, on the credit card, being hooked on credit cards and overspending, absolutely, governments are just as good at that as individuals. The International Monetary Fund, our sibling institution across the street from the World Bank, does a lot of work with governments, reminding them of things called contingent liabilities, which are promises to pay which don't necessarily show up on the budget but become really important when somebody comes and says, I have a contract and I want you to pay. Huge factor, including, for example, as we mentioned earlier, in the current dust-up around renewable energy in the European Union. Spain and Germany in particular, again, the promises to pay that then start to create major fiscal problems in a given country. There are many good examples of public and private sectors working well together and getting the politics right. Probably the one that is most often cited is the water company in Manila, which at the time that the public sector decided that it no longer had the capital to keep up with the growing demand, about 15 years ago, they created two concessions in Manila and auctioned off the rights. One looked like it was designed much better than the other, but the private company that came in didn't really know how to handle relationships with the public or with the government, had all sorts of problems. The other one that looked like it was less attractive financially was run by a Filipino company who has done one of the most spectacular jobs of building relationships with the users, particularly in the lower income parts of Manila, and with the government, to the point that every time that they want to spend more money to lay more pipes or repair things or whatnot, in order to expand services or to improve maintenance, and they need the regulator to approve a tariff increase for them to be able to fund that capital expenditure. They don't go to the regulator with that request. They don't go to the government. They go to the consumers. They go to the poor income areas of Manila and say, look, we can build out these services for you. And they've built up such a relationship and such a track record and credibility that it's actually the low-income consumers that go to the government and say, will you please allow us to pay more money for this service because we actually see what it gets done. And these guys go around the world talking about how they build that up, and they're really a very good role model for this.
I'll just make one other comment. One of my first projects I worked on, it was actually in Nepal, and I don't know how many years ago, 16 years ago or something. There was a public consultation with the local affected community, who would both be users of the electricity that was being produced, but they were also affected by the actual construction site and things. And my understanding was that the village community came to the contractor and said, "Oh my gosh, what you're going to do is going to, we have spirits in this particular rock that lays in this particular area, and your proposed project design goes right through that. And so there were several weeks of consultations and talking to the government and what should we do. If we were to move around, it would cost, I forget how many, $10 million more than anticipated, which affects the tariffs that would be charged by the users. Everything has a cost, and you have to figure out how to recoup that and so on. And finally, somebody went back to the village and said, okay, so our thought is to charge a little bit more, but this way we can go around. And they said, oh, well, don't worry, we'll just move the spirits. So so it was really interesting. But I would like to emphasize that the World Bank and development finance institutions doesn't always get it right. There's no one way to do any of these projects. We live and learn. That was, our public consultation and inclusive sort of process is always a work in progress. Increasingly, we're looking at how to engage more with the community and the users more during the operations of the project. What if there's a dispute, there's a complaint, and so on? And so each of our organizations, I would say, is constantly in an evaluation of itself to how do we do things better. Sometimes we're criticized publicly and it's a call to arms. Sometimes it's lessons learned based on projects we've worked on. We said, oh my gosh, we should be doing this kind of work in every project. So it's always a work in progress. And it's one of the things that's been most exciting to me over the years working for IFC really is it's pretty self-reflective. It's a constant moving target as to what we're focused on. We have many different objectives that each of our projects ideally would focus on, and include gender issues, for example, is I would say mainstream throughout all of our projects now. How are gender issues managed in that particular project? So I think that's been an exciting part of watching for me. How IFC has and the World Bank itself has changed.